And welcome back, everyone. And thank you for staying with us today. This is now the second part of our live stream, and it's a great pleasure to have Susan Etlinger with us on this call. So Susan needs no introduction in the industry. Her TED Talk has been viewed more than 1 million times and was translated into 25 languages. Susan is really well known in the space of ethics of AI, and she is here to speak today on Ada Lovelace Day to our young audience about the importance of ethics. So Susan Etlinger, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure hosting you today, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Elena. Everyone, it's great to be here. I am going to go through some slides pretty quickly so we can get to some Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen here and we can have a chat. So here's the story. Here we are today on Ada Lovelace Day, and it's a good time to sort of look back at what's been changing in our lives. And, for many of you, you've grown up in the digital age. People like me, we sort of had to acclimate to it. But there's really something that's been happening in your lifetime that is a little bit different. And if you can think back to the early days of when you first started to use devices, the ways in which our technology the ways in which we interact with our technologies are changing. And so it used to be that we have to type, and in some cases we have to type, commands into a browser. We still have to do that. We still have to kind of fill out forms online and do that kind of thing. But what's really happening in the last 10 years particularly is that now we're interacting with technology using our vision, using our hearing, listening, language, touch, pinch and zoom. Which, on some devices like your laptop may or may not be possible. And there are even people who are working in smell and taste and trying to digitize those as well. And I'm kind of terrified about smell because at the point when we can go out into the world after COVID, I really shudder to think what happens when people start digitizing smells and pushing them out to us on the street. But that's another story altogether. So the ways in which we're interacting with tech is changing. It's becoming kind of more humanistic, but I won't say more human because it really isn't human. It is technology and it is digitizing experience. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see some of the technologies that are related here. Now, when we think about ethics, the important thing to think about is that we need to understand how AI encodes and amplifies biases in systems. And so, a lot of times people think about technology as something that is inherently neutral, but it's not neutral. It's like a sponge. It absorbs everything in our culture, everything in our society, and it spits that back to us in the form of data. And unfortunately, unlike human beings, or actually maybe even fortunately, unlike human beings, it has no sense of context. And so it can make decisions about us that are completely absent context, and that can actually have really harmful impacts. And so the challenge that I put out there is that we need to understand these technologies well enough so that we can create the kinds of guardrails for them to make sure that these powerful technologies are safe for everybody. And we did this with cars with seatbelts. We do this with food and nutrition labels. We need to do this with technology. So let me move on to the next slide. Here are some types of AI that exist in the world today. We see it mostly in terms of search, in terms of image and face recognition, in terms of listening and language. So as an example, Alexa, Siri, chatbots, translation algorithms, things like that. We see it in robotics. We see it in autonomous vehicles. Even if they're not 100% autonomous, there are algorithms that run, for example, brakes and things like that in cars that exist today. And then this idea that somehow AI can help us to predict. And I put this in quotes because prediction is a very loaded word. And you'll start to see that as I run through some of these examples that, calling something prediction implies that it's true. And very often it's not true. In fact, it's not even close to true or accurate, and it can have some pretty bad consequences. So, we also see social media, obviously, probably most commonly here on social media platforms like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, which, by the way, is obsessed with my hair or thinks I'm obsessed with my hair. And so the ways in which we interact with technology as it exists in social media platforms is a whole other set of issues. And part of what I want to talk about in terms of Ada Lovelace Day is that lately, some of you may be having conversations with your families about this new film, The Social Dilemma. And this particular film, and I'm going to kind of give you my unedited point of view about it, there's some important points that it raises, but the narrative that it tells, which is that social media is controlling our minds and forcing us to do things or encouraging us to do things, that piece is to some extent very true. But the way in which it is framed is very much in the context of sort of suburban white problems. And this is really important, particularly today. Because what it does is it narrows the conversation about what AI is and what ethics is into, you know, will your teenage son become an incel? Will your teenage daughter become a cam girl? And this is a problem because the people who created this film are the very people, in many cases, who actually created the problems in the first place. And so what it's done is it's excluded the voices of the people who have been working to understand how AI and how technologies affect us from a societal standpoint for the last 20 plus years. And so it's really important as we think about Ada Lovelace to think about the fact that Ada Lovelace today, the people like you who are out there in the world and who are entering into this field, you're going to look very different in many cases. You may be neurodiverse, you may be gay, you may be, you know, not white, different races. You may be different coming from different cultural backgrounds. You may identify in terms of gender differently. So it's really important to think about this from a much broader perspective. And also for me to say that as a white woman, a cisgender white woman, everything I learned about AI ethics, I learned from scholars of color and trans and non-binary scholars and people who have been living this work for a long time. And so I'm going to introduce you to some of those people today. So here are some of the issues that we have to think about. And these are important, not just from a societal standpoint, but also in terms of business and the organizations that we interact with. So the 4 issues, when we think about AI, what makes it different from other technologies is that it can learn from data and that it can interact or can act autonomously. So it can make decisions and do stuff. And so the issues that are most important are, number 1, bias. You know, there's documented bias in data and algorithms. And by bias, I don't mean bias in a data science sense where you have to have a bias in order to get an answer. I mean discrimination. I mean harmful impacts on real people. The next piece is around authenticity. You know, you have to know what you're interacting with, and you have to have the ability to know when what you're seeing isn't true or isn't real. We see this with deep fakes, but we also see this with chatbots that try to sound like real people without any disclosure. The next piece is around explanation. We need to understand why they came to the conclusions that they did. And the last piece is around responsible use. You know, we need to have some laws on the books. We need to have norms about how we behave and how we use this stuff so that we can protect human rights. And there are some real impacts to that. So I'm going to run through some stuff that some of you may have seen and some of you may have not, just to give you a real quick survey of what we're up against when we look at AI today. In search, for example, this example on the left comes from Safiya Noble's book. I'm going to introduce you to her. She's an amazing woman who has written a book called Algorithms of Oppression, and How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, I think is the full title. This was an article she wrote for Time magazine called Google Has a Striking History of Bias Against Black Girls. And on the left, you see the search, and the search is professor style. And if you look at the images, they're mostly white men. This was from March 26, 2018, when she published that article. She may have accessed it earlier, but this is pretty much 2.5 years ago. And then I did professor style. I did a professor style search yesterday, and I encourage you guys to try it as well. On the right, and you see there are a few more people of color in there. There are a few more women. You know, Google is trying to do a better job here. Not necessarily always succeeding, let's be honest. Then there's face recognition. This was a situation on the left that came up a few weeks ago on Twitter where a gentleman, a professor at a university was trying to change his virtual background. and Zoom kept omitting his head. I mean, there's no other way to say it. And when they dug deep to figure it out, they discovered that, in fact, the face recognition algorithm in Zoom is very poor. And so it was not recognizing his face. And on the right, we have issues with Twitter. The Twitter discovered that they have been cropping Black people from their photo algorithm. So when they give you a preview image, the algorithm was actually favoring the white face over the Black face. And there are many, many reasons for this that have to do with the way that the algorithm was trained and the data that was used. But this is a pretty much unforgivable mistake. And it's, by the way, a drop in the bucket in terms of all the other types of ways in which face recognition behaves in ways that reinforce stereotypes. And that doesn't even touch the issue of what happens once face recognition is actually used in surveillance or in, biometric types of applications. That's a whole other issue and an important one, but we only have a finite amount of time. So I also want to talk about classification, because algorithms try to figure out what you are. On the left, it tries to figure out whether you're a man or a woman. And by the way, usually it's that binary. You get those two choices. You know that if you're a non-binary person, that there are too many times in the course of your day, in the course of your life, when you're forced into a bucket that you do not fit into. And so part of the challenge here is to ensure a couple things. Number one, that the choices do exist for a spectrum of gender identification, but also how important is gender really in terms of determining what you want, whether you want shoes, whether you want, a new hair dryer. Like in many cases, gender is used as a proxy for something else about you that probably isn't true or that probably is stereotypical. And so this comes from the early days of demographics when, women liked cooking and men liked, hunting and fishing. And on the right, you see this exactly being replicated in an algorithm. So on the right, you see that this is part of a study about how algorithms determine gender. And as this algorithm was trained over and over on a set of biased data, it amplified the bias to the point where anytime there was a photo of somebody cooking in a kitchen, and you can look down and you can see the agent is the person, right? A woman or a man, only two choices. What is the food? What is the heat source? What is the tool being used, and where is the place, right? And this is used for things like stock footage and that sort of thing. That the more it was trained on this biased data, the more it was likely to determine that if a human being was in a kitchen, that human being had to be a woman. And that's the fourth image from the left. So I'm not going to, guess gender here, but I'd make a bet that is not how that person identifies himself. The next is around language technology. This is really, again, another sort of insidious thing that we see. And it comes out in all sorts of weird ways. So for example, during our recent Black Lives Matter protests in the US, and by the way, I wanna just sort of stop and acknowledge something, which is that most of my references here and most of the people I refer to will be North America based. Not all of them, but most of them. And that's simply because those are the people who I know, but I'm not trying to imply that somehow that's the only place that all this stuff is working. It's just, there's a lot to know. So if any of you have scholars or people you think I should be following or aware of, I would love to hear from you. So in terms of content moderation, Google's advertising platform blocked an article about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. In fact, it was Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, because a lot of times these content moderation algorithms can't tell the difference between something like a woman breastfeeding her child and pornography. And this is why there is on Instagram a no nipple rule, no visible nipples, because they can't tell the difference between a woman's nipple showing up in an image and, for whatever reason, and pornography. And what they're really trying to do is, of course, prevent child pornography and human trafficking content from showing up. So there's this balancing act, but it ends up, of course, silencing a lot of speech that's really important. And so you end up with a sort of human rights issue, or on one hand or the other. And then on the other side, there's a lot of disparity, and we've seen this with images, we see this with speech, in speech recognition for people with accents, for people who speak dialects, for people who have certain ways, regional types of speech, for African American vernacular English. And so there are racial disparities. And when we're building systems that communicate with people, it's critically important that we feel heard. And that we feel heard, especially if our voices are not voices that are usually heard in sort of social interactions or in kind of society. So if we have voices that are typically not heard, the idea that an inanimate object would not be able to understand us is offensive and harmful. Then we get predictions, and again, massive air quotes here. This independent article is about something that I know happened in the UK, where the algorithm was trying to figure out what your grade would be, based on all these kind of signals. Heaven knows what was actually in there. There could have been all sorts of stuff, but the reality is there are lots of issues with this, not least of which is that the grade you would have gotten? Another issue would be, are there biases in that algorithm that are assuming that because you are a certain type of person or identify with a certain group or are of a certain attribute or background, that somehow your grades would be affected by that? And that is a problem as well. It's a use case problem, meaning that we shouldn't necessarily be using it for these types of things. The second example here is the same thing. Who cares whether an algorithm can determine whether you're gay or straight from a photograph? And by the way, what does that even mean? What does that even mean anymore when our identifications are so fluid? What does it even mean in terms of buying behavior? And by the way, how could this data be, for example, is it even accurate? Of course not. And then how could it be misused by governments that are more restrictive on things like this? And so, there are all of these terrible, terrible uses for algorithms that are pretending that these are predictions, and they are not. And this is also used in hiring. This is where we also see tremendous, tremendous issues for neurodiverse people. So for example, if there is a face recognition technology that is trying to detect your emotions, which by the way is not possible and is based on pseudoscience, how is that going to work on neurodivergent people? How is that going to work on people from cultures where expressiveness is different, right? The idea of facial expressiveness is different. And so this can be extremely harmful for people. So I've given you a whole bunch of bad news. Now I'm going to give you some good news. There's a lot of bad stuff out there, but at the same time, there are people who have been working in this field even before this field existed. And what I mean is there is a field called STS, Science, Technology, and Society, that's been around for about 20 plus years. People have been looking at the ways in which technology affects society and the ways in which society affects technology. And the conversation between the technology industry on the one hand, and I'll just, broad brush say, the people who created the Social Dilemma film and the people who have been working in academia could not look more different. And so I want to give you a sense of who these people are, because these are the Ada Lovelaces for today that you need to know about and whose work we need to amplify. And again, I want to say, I would not be here in front of you today if it were not for these people and if it were not for the work that they have already done. So my job here is to amplify their work. And it's really important that we know who they are. So Safiya Noble. Safiya Noble is a professor at UCLA. She's the author of Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. She is one of the people who you should know about. And I'm going to give you a book list too as part of this. So get ready to do a screenshot if you would like, and we can talk about this more. But really what she's saying is, we're just at the very beginning of this. We're just starting to understand the long-term consequences of these tools. And so part of your challenge is to start to foresee what could happen and start to think about what are the ways in which we could be addressing them. The next two people you should know about are Timnit Gebru and Joy Buolamwini. Timnit is now at Google, Joy is now at MIT. They are the authors of the Gender Shades Project. They are the people who, and I highly recommend that you check this out if you haven't seen it, who looked at the ways in which darker skinned people are misrepresented and misunderstood by face recognition technology. They did this work, I want to say 3 years ago. And one thing that's also really important as you look at this, these examples of the new Ada Lovelaces, or the Ada Lovelaces for today, who I want to amplify, is that these women did not have an easy time and still do not have an easy time telling these stories. And they are at some of the most respected institutions in the world. They have received hate speech. They have received all sorts of threats. They have been called into the principal's office or the boss's office to be told that their work is too racialized. The privilege that I have is I don't get that, but I feel that my responsibility on the other side is to amplify them, and many other people need to be doing it as well. Brilliant, brilliant women. Here's a reading list, just to give you a quick run through. If you want to know about search and how algorithms reinforce racism, read Safiya Noble's book. Shoshana Zuboff was in The Social Dilemma. Very, very brilliant woman, is talking about sort of the new age of surveillance capitalism, why surveillance is so integral to the way that we have built business today. So that's the other side of the face recognition problem. Invisible Women is a wonderful book about how women have been excluded from data for many, many, many years. Even back to like seat belts, for example, which were designed for men, and women would die disproportionately in car crashes in the earlier days because they were designed for men's heights. And so when things like what are they called? The big pillows that explode when you hit a car, those, whatever, I forget they're called. They would hit the crash test dummy in the chest if it was a man, but in the face if it was a woman, because women tend to be shorter. So of course it's not just women, but people of shorter stature. Weapons of Math Destruction, brilliant book by Cathy O'Neill. If you want to know how algorithms affect education, healthcare, financial, your ability to get loans and financial services and insurance rates and things like that. If you are a person of color, you already know this, but it's really, really helpful to see how it plays out. Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks is another book that is, I actually haven't read this one, full disclosure, but this is another book about how we were building algorithms to kind of amplify inequality rather than addressing it. Ruha Benjamin's new book, Race After Technology. And then we've got Virginia Dignam's Responsible Artificial Intelligence. And then Mary Gray and Siddharth, sorry, I think is his last name, wrote Ghost Work, which is about how we are creating another underclass of people who are labeling this data and who are doing the sort of grocery delivery work, and how this work is sort of invisible as well. And Mary just won a MacArthur Fellowship actually this past week. So I want to close with a statement from Ruha Benjamin, who I think is one of the foremost people we should be talking about today. And, you know, I've given you a lot of bad news, and I've given you a lot of sort of ways in which technology can be destructive, but it's extremely powerful. And it also has the opportunity to be an incredibly good force as well. We just have to use it with compassion, and we have to use it with intelligence. And we can't allow these trends to continue. And the only way that we can do that is to understand deeply what's happening. And so, you know, Ruha Benjamin's quote here, which actually comes from her website, is really a kind of challenge to us to think about the utopias or the protopias or the futures that we want to live in, and the ways that we want this technology to work for us and not against us. And so I'm just going to close with that, because I think it's really important not to just think about this as sort of a trail of tears, but to think about it as a challenge to all of us to use technology, not just to reduce the bad, but actually to amplify the good. And that's me. If you want to follow me on Twitter or connect with me on LinkedIn or send me a note on email, please feel free. If you email me or connect with me, just remind me that it was from Ada Lovelace. If you would like this reading list or there are other questions that you have, I'm more than happy to answer them. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can talk. Thank you.
Fantastic. Wow, Susan, that's incredible. You have literally mentioned all of my favorite people. We have also mentioned quite a lot, and I traditionally share Joy's TED Talk all the time. Literally every single hackathon, I insist this is your compulsory viewing. You have to see this TED Talk. And sometimes if it is a face-to-face hackathon, I remember in times of no COVID, I used to start my second day of the hackathon with Joy's TED Talk, and I would actually watch it with everyone in the room, and we would have a little discussion about why this is such an important topic. So thank you so much for, again, highlighting the most incredible women out there who are doing some pioneering work. So I'm really grateful. So the one thing I noticed you did mention is Joy's latest film, Coded Bias, is out.
Yes.
Ready? Yes, I have shared it last week with children in Brunei when I saw somebody was creating this event and it was free to watch that film. I will keep an eye, and maybe we could also organize a viewing, for this cohort or for other teenagers as well. I think it's also like a must film, and everyone needs to see how bias is really coded. But anyway, so Susan, we have a lot of questions for you.
Yeah, of course.
And the first question I have is, do the risks of AI and its potential biases outweigh the potential for good AI has?
So I'm going to answer this question, but first I want to go back to coded bias for a second.
Yes.
Because part of the issue around coded bias is it is not very easily available. Mm-hmm. So in the US, we've been having a hard time getting access to it. And instead, what we're getting is the social network. And so if any of you are not aware, yesterday in the United States was what used to be called Columbus Day. And you're probably all aware of the term Columbusing. And so, so this is kind of this should be the second example in the dictionary under Columbusing, because this film, The Social Dilemma, is essentially Columbusing all of this scholarship that was pioneered by trans activists and scholars and women of color and other people from other marginalized groups. And so it's really important that the voices like Joy's and Timnit's and others have the same distribution in addition to the funding to be able to make these films, and so that we can have these conversations in a much more well-rounded way. Now, my answer to the first question is, right now we are living in the very early ugly days of this sort of digital capitalism. And, for any of you, whatever your political affiliation may be, you can look back at history and you can see the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when people were dying of black lung, when people when people, for example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York, which was essentially, all these women died who were sewing in this tenement or in this sweatshop, because there were no rules for employee welfare. There were no rules to protect people. We're in that phase today where it's ugly, it's dirty, people are being harmed. But these technologies do very beautiful things too, right? So they help us understand more about the natural world, more about how plants grow. There's tremendous potential to use these technologies to better understand the world around us, to kind of turn the lens back on itself. So I will say no technology is inherently good or bad, even artificial intelligence. But the challenge with artificial intelligence is that we have to remember that, number one, it is not magic robots. It is a set of tools. And so part of what annoys me about the way we talk about artificial intelligence is that we talk about it a lot of times as if it's magic. And when we do that, we disenfranchise anybody who could possibly have a role to play. And so I think we should be extremely skeptical, extremely clear, But absolutely, there are positive use cases, and there are many, many of them around the world. For example, using face recognition to identify trafficked children. You know, I mean that, you know, for every bad story that you hear, there's going to be a good story too. It's just that, again, you have this very, very difficult set of decisions to make.
Talking of facial recognition, and I remember we also discussed emotion recognition as well, or emotion AI. And when we had a chat on the call, we've spoken about moratoriums, declared by AI Now Institute on facial recognition for obvious good reasons. Talk to me about your opinions on the emotion AI. I know you have very strong opinions on this technology. What do you think of it?
Am I allowed to swear?
Well, no, but try to use some other words, substitute.
Okay. Let's just say there's no such thing. There is no such thing as emotion recognition technology. It is based on race science. It's based on bogus science, right? So the science upon which this idea that somehow when I'm smiling, I'm happy. Sometimes when I'm smiling, I'm not so happy. When I'm frowning, I'm sad. I mean, I had an example I was going to show you of an image from IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, that is of, I think, Albert Einstein and a number of other people. It's all scientists who are receiving some kind of an award, I don't know, maybe in the turn of the 19th century. And everybody looks very formal, you know, the way they do in old photographs. And one of these so-called emotion recognition tools classifies everybody into their mood, right? And so the men are neutral. They're classified as neutral because they're just looking like this. And the one woman in the group is classified as angry, same expression, right? And so, you know, this term resting bee face, right? This is how this stuff gets encoded into technology. And so this idea that we can have any certainty about how a facial expression connects with somebody's interior life is ridiculous.
Great.
I
really wanted to hear that response coming from you. Fantastic. So we have another question from a teenager, and it's we hear the phrase AI as a democratizing force thrown around so often. Do you think AI truly is a democratizing force when it comes to developed versus developing countries?
Oh, goodness. So that's a brilliant question. Developing countries, there are so many layers to this question that we could be here for an entire semester. And I will also tell you that in terms of, you know, my depth is not that deep on this topic. But let me just say this. There are so many issues around developing countries. One of them is access, right? Access to the technology, funds to be able to build it, stable infrastructure to be able to support it. So for example, if you live in sub-Saharan Africa and your generators are off, you know, from 7 a.m. in the morning to 7 p.m. in the evening, and you are at home now because of COVID, you need to have access to fuel to run the generators, to get the connectivity, to get to the internet. You need money to get a data plan. There are all sorts of layers of issues here. And so I do think that historically technologies have been pushed on some populations in the world as a democratizing force, when in fact they're a colonializing force. However, I also think that there's some really interesting things being built in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And there's a friend of mine who's actually a venture capitalist who invests almost exclusively in that region. And they're doing some amazing things that are locally relevant and that are in support of their own economies and in support of their own communities. So I think I hate to say this to whoever you are out there, but it's a yes and no answer.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. A lot of really interesting stuff is happening out of Africa right now. I'm also keeping a very close eye on this region because there is a lot of really interesting technology being developed there as well. Right, we have some other questions, and the question is, what is the biggest challenge the young people will have to solve in tech and AI in the future, in your opinion?
I think the biggest challenge is representation.
Mm.
When you look at the companies that control funding and development, they are struggling with representation. If you hear the term pipeline problem, we can't find any, we can't find any employees of color. We can't find, it's just run the other way. That is, it's embarrassing to hear that. So I think the biggest issue is representation. The biggest issue is proving, not proving, is changing the script, right? Changing the script from this idea that, and I'm going to just bash on the social dilemma again, just because it's fun, but, the idea that somehow the people who created the problems are the same people who can solve them. There's actually a quote attributed to Albert Einstein, which is not a real, he didn't really actually say this, but the idea of it is we can't solve problems with the same thinking that created them. And he didn't actually say that. He said something semi-related about nuclear power, essentially, another extremely powerful technology. But the biggest issue is around getting into the room, to being able to have that, voice. And then once you're in the room, and this is a big issue around, that diversity and equity and inclusion consultants know about, is that it's not just, it can't just be you. Right? You have to have other people in the room with you from different backgrounds, because as an individual person, and we've seen this with some of the people I talked about today, when they're the one voice, they tend to get excluded. And so this is an issue, very frankly, of white supremacy and of the kind of ways in which this default assumption that things need to be built and owned by white people and that any other model doesn't work will undermine everything, and not just the way that we use AI. And so I think we have to, and by we, I mean white people as well, we have to be working in support of a much more diverse and much more representative workforce and power structure.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that, which is why we obviously run these kind of hackathons where everyone is, we even build teams, making sure there's diversity across. This is so important. So I have another question, and I think this probably, again, is a question, we can talk about it for hours and hours. How can we expect such data-reliant technology like AI to not be biased when, as a global society, we have so much systemic racial, gender, sexuality, various biases like that?
So that, again, it's a brilliant question. This is a really interesting topic in the sense that it is true that society feeds data and data feeds algorithms and teaches algorithms to be racist. If any of you remember that whole Microsoft Tay experiment from a few years ago, this is, by the way, the technology underlying Tay, which, by the way, for those of you who weren't aware, Tay was a chatbot that Microsoft introduced on Twitter a couple of years ago, saying, "Hi, I'm Tay, talk to me and, I'll learn from you." And within 24 hours, it was like this white supremacist, Nazi, racist, horrible thing, and they had to take it down. Now, this is the same technology that exists in the form of Xiaoice, which is a chatbot in China that is used by millions, if not billions, of people. And in China, there is a social, cultural understanding that you don't do stuff like that, right? For a lot of different reasons, some of which, we don't have time to go into. And so it is true that the algorithm will absorb anything you have. However, and this is why I'm so focused here on accountability. And in the work that I do with businesses, what I'm saying to them is, you can't plead ignorance anymore. You can't plead ignorance and say, oh, the technology is it's just a tool. It's like a hammer. If I use it to build something, that's good. And if I use it to hurt somebody, that's bad. And so you have to understand how it works. And so then you have to build in guardrails. So for example, I'll give you some examples of things that are happening in the world now that are real. There are moves by cities and governments and also businesses to include in AI research an impact assessment. The same way that if you build something in your city, you would have an environmental impact assessment, you have an algorithmic impact assessment. Could this model, could this tool or app harm people, and if so, how? So you have to think about that before you put it out there. There are also guardrails in the development process. And sorry, somebody's doing some weird work outside and I have my window open because it's hot. So apologies for that background noise. Hang on a second. I'll be right back. Let me close the window.
So everyone, while Susan is closing the window, if you have any more questions, now is the time to ask them. Because we very rarely can get...
Sorry about that. Real world COVID situations here of working at home. So where was I? So they also have companies like, for example, Microsoft and Salesforce and Intuit and various other tech companies have done some really beautiful work around building ethics into the agile development methodology. So for example, you look at your data models when you're defining whether you're ready to build. You look at your data models when you're defining whether you're finished. You're building those things in. Salesforce announced something called model cards, which is, again, another disclosure about what your data model is and should do. Very much, again, along the lines of these sort of nutrition labels, so that you can see where the data comes from. You can start to understand what the impact might be on people. There are other things around asking vendors and suppliers and partners to adhere to privacy practices that may be greater than the privacy practices that they would have to do under GDPR or other similar types of rules. And so there are lots of different ways in which organizations are starting to build these accountability structures into their development methodologies and into their business, very much along the lines of how we look at data privacy, more so in the European Union and UK than in North America, for example. But these things are happening. And so there is a pretty big and growing and very dynamic ethics community that exists and that you can become part of.
That's brilliant to know. And we have another question that's more relevant to your career today. So somebody's asking you to tell us about your career and how you got where you are today and what were your biggest challenges.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so this is a classic case of do as I say, not as I do. So I have a background, my undergraduate degree is in rhetoric, believe it or not. So I spent my undergraduate years learning about how language persuades people to do things and how we use language as a tool. I didn't have any interest in technology at all. And I fell into it by accident, mostly because I live in San Francisco and that's what we do. And so I fell into it by accident and I worked in marketing and communications, which I hated, but I was good at it. And then at a certain point, I made a career change, actually, after my son was born, and he was back in school, and I decided I wanted to be an analyst. And so I started looking at social media technologies, and I started looking at the data. And when I started looking at data, and I started looking at the ways in which data was used, particularly with social media, I became very interested in the fact that we don't really understand how this stuff works. And that's what led me into talking about ethics. That's what led me into looking at privacy and ethical data use. And so I've had a sort of meandering career. And I will say, like, I really enjoy what I do now, but I didn't when I was younger. I probably paid more dues than I should have in some companies that I didn't need to be in as long as I was. So I guess what I would say is if you're looking for a model, I don't think you don't want a model. You want to find your own way. And that means a combination of doing the things that you have to do to build skills, but also following your heart and following your interests. And I'm so much happier now because when I first started doing this work, and people asked me what I was doing, and I would say, oh, I'm really looking at, data privacy or AI ethics. They would be like, go away. Why are you talking to me about this? This sounds so boring. Now it's trendy and fashionable. And that's a real problem because now that it's trendy and fashionable, it's bringing a lot of people in because they think that somehow they will be able to do some kind of social signaling around their kind of wokeness using this work. And I really had to hit myself over the head in the last year or so about my role in this. And that's why I really want to focus so much on amplifying other people's voices as opposed to my own.
That is amazing. And so to finish off, Susan, I have the last question, and that is, why is an event or why is Ada Lovelace Day so important? And could you leave us with your last tips of advice for the young people who are embarking on this journey of designing a product using AI? What should they be mindful of? So two things. One is, why is today important? Why are we celebrating Ada Lovelace Day? And the second one is, it's day 4 of them developing their products. So it's a very crucial day when they are now looking at the choice of technologies that they're building, that they will be using to build their products. Ethics is very important. So they are required to have at least 2 sessions with an ethics mentor as part of the entire product cycle development. We have a few ethics mentors in Discord as well to help them with. So what tips and advice would you offer to them?
Right. Okay, so let's start with Ada Lovelace Day. So let's not forget that Ada Lovelace was the daughter of Lord Byron, that she was wealthy, that she was part of a social circle in which she had access to people like Babbage. Let's not forget that she had, that even though her voice was, let's say, silenced or minimized for quite some time, that she had advantages that most of us don't have or will never hope to have. So it's important to look at her. It's also important to look at other people, for example, the mathematicians at NASA, the mathematicians at and the code breakers at Bletchley Park, and various other women and people throughout history who have done tremendous things. So Ada Lovelace Day is important for me because it reminds me, number one, that we have to look outside the sort of standard set of leaders and pioneers and futurists that, when you do a Google search on them, are almost invariably middle-aged white men. And look for the thinkers who don't necessarily get the same amount of airtime. But it also reminds me that in doing so, we can't then default to a sort of, privileged white view of the world either. I've learned so much, and some of these have been uncomfortable truths. I will be completely honest with you all about that, about where I fit in all of this. And I don't even know the answer to it. So to me, Ada Lovelace Day is about, and also coming right after, Indigenous Peoples Day, which was Columbus Day, reminds me that even as we are trying to widen the sphere of how we talk about these technologies and their impacts on society, that we have to keep pushing and that we have to keep giving other people a voice. Now, in terms of building, and by the way, that means sometimes stepping aside. And Elena, you and I had this conversation at the very beginning when you approached me, and I said, I want to make sure before I do this that I am not, in a parade of other white faces, women or not, white cisgender faces. And we talked about this because I wanted to be sure that we're not perpetuating that same kind of issue as we do this. So, and I'm very, very happy to see that the group has been extremely diverse. In terms of what we build, one of the issues around AI is that a lot of the people who have had the money and had the funding have had the funding because of access and have had the funding that has given them the privilege of being able to build things that they wanted. There's a woman named Kara Swisher who is a very well-known journalist here in the Bay Area and actually all over the United States. In fact, I think she just moved to New York. Kara once said that Silicon Valley is like an assisted living facility for young white men, meaning that everything that was being built was like, how do I get my pizza faster? How do I make my juice faster? How do I get better? How do I get my coffee faster? How do I shave faster? Everything was built to sort of create more convenience in the lives of people who are already very privileged. So what I would say to you is, don't go looking for solutions without a problem. Go looking for solutions that are meaty solutions to meaty problems. And if you can do something that really changes the balance, then I think that's something you'll be proud of for your whole life. And this is why, you know, we have to be resistant to some of these new technologies that come out that sort of automate things that are fairly trivial. Now, people have made tons of money off of them, so everybody's choice is everybody's choice.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Susan. This is such an incredible way to end our Ada Lovelace live stream. Thank you so much for tuning in. So everyone, thank you for tuning in today to listen to two incredible speakers today, Ivana and Susan. So we will be tuning back in tomorrow at 5 o'clock again to hear from other incredibly inspiring speakers. So we're here to inspire you all week. And obviously to teach you lots that hopefully will be relevant to the products that you're building, because the products you're building should be, number one, be impactful. So they should be changing the world. They should be something you should be proud of, the world should be proud of, and you ultimately will be the ones to lead the future of technology. So we want to make sure they are in the right hands where you can build something ethically responsible and something meaningful. So thank you so much for tuning in today. It was the Ada Lovelace very special live stream today with two incredible people, and we will be back tomorrow. So tune back in at 5 o'clock. See you back soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.